There we go.
You're there. Okay.
I'm here.
There
Hi,
she is.
everybody.
So I'm going to turn off my video and let Kristen take over. If you have any questions, there's a little chat box and you can just ask us.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fall Birding webinar. I'm very excited to be back. Actually, ironically, the last presentation I gave right before COVID shutdowns began was to the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust, and we had such a great time that day. Really enjoyed speaking to everyone. Great crowd. So I'm really excited to be back talking about birds again. And it's such a beautiful time of year to get outside. So it's a wonderful time to talk about fall and fall birding. So my name's Kristen. I own Wild Birds Unlimited in Barrie and Newmarket. We're retail stores that sell backyard bird feeding products. And as Eileen said, we've been a little busy during COVID, which is awesome. People are getting really interested in exploring their own backyards and beyond in Ontario, which is always a great thing. So I get to talk to people about birds pretty much every day, and I love doing it. And I'm also a birder myself. So I do spend a lot of time looking for birds in my spare time and other things too. I love nature in general. And in addition to that, I absolutely love leading programs like this and teaching people about nature. So I'm very excited to be here, and I definitely want to tune in for that goldenrod seminar. That looks awesome. I'm with Eileen on that. So if you have any questions while things are happening today, I think maybe the best way to kind of sort those is if you can type in a question. I believe there's a Q&A section, should be on your bottom bar there with the other options, and you can type your question in there. And then Aileen and Nikki are on hand for at least part of the presentation to answer any IT questions and maybe some birding questions. And then anything that doesn't get answered, I will look to answer at the end of the presentation. So please type it in there so you don't forget, and I'll be able to see those at the end and answer your questions. All right, so with that, I'm going to share my screen. Oh, it says host has disabled screen sharing. So I might need Aileen to help me out with that.
Okay, you should be good now, Kristen. Sorry.
Perfect. Okay, I'm just gonna make this full screen here. Ta-da! Okay, there we go, fall birding. And this is a very classic picture of fall for me, a blue jay hiding an acorn or carrying off an acorn. That's a very fall bird thing. So I thought I'd put that in there. So just a brief outline of today's presentation. So we're going to talk about fall migration in general. Then we're going to move on to the ID challenges that fall poses, because there's definitely some tricky stuff that's happening in the fall that we don't necessarily run into in, for example, the spring. We're going to talk about weather and fall birding, because it does have, they're directly correlated with each other, specifically with migration. We're going to talk a little bit about where to find birds in the fall, how to find birds in the fall, and winter arrivals. I know I said the W word, but they come in the fall, so we're going to talk about those guys too. And then we're going to just end off with a couple slides just about feeding the birds, because it's a great way to bring them to your backyard, and they have a little bit of a different need in the fall than they do during other times of the year. So let's get right into it. So why go birding in the fall? So there's lots of reasons why you should get birding out year-round, but specifically in the fall, I personally like that you don't have to worry about mosquitoes and deer flies or black flies. That's one of my favorite things about bird watching in the fall. You still need to be prepared for ticks. So they are out in the fall. So you do want to make sure that you are staying away from long grasses and that you're using products that will help to keep ticks off of you. That is something to think about. But in terms of other biting insects, they're few and far between. So it's a great time to get outdoors and not be annoyed by those insects. So once the leaves start to drop off, it's a lot easier to see the birds. So this also happens in the early spring before the leaves come out on the deciduous trees. Once we get into those leaves opening, a lot of the different birds that we have breeding in Ontario really like to stay high in the trees, specifically the songbirds. And so they can be a little bit tricky to find through all that foliage. So I kind of like once those leaves begin to fall, and I'm starting to see the first few hints of color changes, I'm sure you guys are as well. I saw a bright red tree today as I was driving. But once those leaves begin to drop, you get much better views of the birds that are hanging out up high. And so that's really handy. There's certainly a lot of birds around in the fall. So not only do we have a migration happening, so we have big movements of birds coming from up north in Northern Ontario, coming down through Southern Ontario, but we also have young birds. So all of those birds who are able to raise families in the summertime did. And so our bird population goes way up because not only do we have the adults, but we also have all these juveniles who are just as big as their parents and beginning to be independent and make flight journeys of their own if they're migrating. So fall offers us the opportunity to observe a lot of birds that are difficult to see during other parts of the year. So a good example of that would be shorebirds. So shorebirds, a lot of them breed in the high Arctic. And so we only get to see those guys when they're passing through on their spring and fall migrations. So this is a great opportunity to get out there and look for shorebirds and other species that are coming from places that maybe we don't get to travel to most often if we're living in Southern Ontario. So eventually, the majority of species will migrate through August, September, and October, and our different types of species will go down. So once migration kind of settles in the late fall, we have a lot less species that are around our natural areas. And what that means, I always say to folks, if birding is new for you, if you're getting into birding, a great time to go is during the winter when there's a lot less species, because as you're learning, it can be sometimes overwhelming to start out birding and then head down to like Rondo or Point Pelee in the springtime when you have like thousands and thousands of birds and all these different species and colors. It can be a little overwhelming, and I'm not saying not to do that, but winter is a nice time and late fall is a great time because we don't have quite as many species. So you can learn the ones that are more common in your neighborhood that are probably going to be here for most of the year. There are resident birds, and so it allows you to kind of dip your feet into it and get used to the birds that you know are in your area and you know are in your neighborhood, and get familiar with them. And that way, when other birds are migrating through or are coming for the summertime, it can be a little bit less overwhelming to try and narrow down what the new birds are. So in other words, you're getting familiar with the birds that are in your neighborhood, and then you can recognize some of the new ones that come in during migration periods. So we also have different birds that overwinter in Southern Ontario, and they begin to arrive in the fall. So I'm going to talk about a little bit more about this, but I've just started seeing reports of Junkos in Southern Ontario, so that's really exciting. So they do start to arrive, some of these birds, in September and October. And folks, generally in a normal year, in a non-COVID year, in the fall, we're back to work, back to school. Vacation times have been used up for the most part. So it is a really good opportunity to get outdoors into parks that might be busy during other times of the year with reservations and such. And so it makes a great time to get out and explore those areas during an off-peak time, but still a time that's really pleasant weather-wise and that offers great viewing opportunities of the birds. So those are some of the reasons you definitely want to get out in the fall. And then we have to talk about the challenges that fall brings. So there are some trickier bird IDs in the fall than we have during some other times of the year, particularly with certain groups of birds. So Aileen touched on warblers, and that's one of the groups that can be very tricky in the fall because they look totally different. They are in their basic plumage or their winter or non-breeding plumage. And so they look totally different than they look in the spring with all the bright colors. So you need to work a little bit harder to ID those birds as they're working their way south. Fall is also a time when we see a lot of molting birds. So we see really strange bird plumage patterns. So here's a little example. I just threw in a picture I took of a molting grosbeak who's transitioning out of juvenile plumage into more adult look. And yeah, they're just some weird looking birds. A lot of people see things like bald blue jays, bald cardinals. We have young birds that are transitioning into adult plumages, and they're halfway sort of between both. So we see some very strange looking birds during this time of the year. And birds aren't singing as much as they normally are. So birds sing on territory when they're interested in attracting a mate and making sure they're protecting their territory. And so we don't get quite as many vocalizations. So they're a lot quieter. So they can be a little bit more difficult to track down sometimes. So let's talk about the fall migration and learn a little bit more about what's going on with our birds during this time. So first of all, I think it's important to talk about when migration begins, because for some species, it starts as early as June. As strange as that sounds, fall migration starts as early as June, and it goes all the way up until December for some species. So it is a really, really long migration. And so the peak is definitely August, September, and October. But things begin early. So shorebirds are one of the ones that a lot of people think of as some of the early migrants. They have a longer distance, and when they're wrapped up raising their families up north in the Arctic, they begin moving south. So a great time to look for shorebirds, for example, is August, and right now in September. Similarly, ruby-throated hummingbirds, the males, after they have done their final breeding with the female, she raises usually 2 broods of babies. And once his job is done, because the female raises the young on her own in the hummingbird world, he begins to think about heading south. So male hummingbirds begin migrating as early as the end of July, which is interesting. So birds during migration are moving pretty much every day during those peak migration times, August, September, and October. And the volume of their migration really depends on the weather and what the weather's doing. And we're going to go into detail a bit more later on in the presentation about that, because that's really important. So many birds are basically waiting for good weather conditions before they travel south. So I'll get into more details later on. But yes, weather plays a big role in migration. So in terms of migration strategies, some birds migrate during the day. So think about birds like hawks or vultures that are using thermals in order to ride the waves south while they migrate. Things like sandhill cranes and geese, right? I think we're probably all familiar with seeing geese fly overhead in the V formations. Those typically are happening during the day. And then there's another group of birds that migrates at night, and those tend to be long distance migrants. Those typically are land birds, things like warblers and sparrows and thrushes, who are making large movements at nighttime. Some birds migrate basically overnight, and then in the morning they drop out of the sky, they land on the ground, they refuel as much as they can. They might take a bit of a breather, get some rest. And then once they're refueled, they pick back up again and take off when nighttime returns. Others will migrate nonstop once started, and that could happen during certain parts of a migration. So a really good example of that is a lot of our birds from Ontario, if they are going to Central America, they will actually migrate right over the Gulf of Mexico. So not always, but those birds that are traveling to the Caribbean or Central America, they might, as they cross large bodies of water, do that in a nonstop flight. And for the Gulf of Mexico, that's roughly about 18 hours nonstop flying in good conditions. So that's a long, long journey. So these guys, as small as they are, some of these birds, it's incredible the types of distances that they are traveling. Some species are really hardwired for certain timings when they need to leave their breeding ground, and that could be because of ecological reasons or over time evolutionarily, or it could be for climate purposes. So there's some variation there. And in general, the fall migration takes 2 to 6 times longer for most species to complete than the spring migration. When we think of the spring migration, a lot of birds are trying to get back here just as fast as they can to begin setting up territories, right? First, the early bird gets the worm, so to speak, or the breeding territory for a lot of species. So they want to make sure they're back here with enough time to get on territory, defend their territory, find a mate, etc. And usually the males are first returning back to breeding territories. So the fall migration, they can move at a bit more of a leisurely pace. Weather is good generally, especially for species starting earlier. They can take their time and migrate over a series of, several weeks, maybe even a couple months. And so it takes a little bit longer because they're not in a need to rush. So in terms of daytime migration, this can be absolutely spectacular to watch. So there is nothing like hawk watching and seeing large movements or kettles of hawks coming together, and most notably usually along coastlines or ridges. It is incredible. So if you have never tried hawk watching, this is a wonderful time of year to do it. In fact, I've started seeing the reports coming from some of the hawk watching stations around Ontario, and the numbers are fantastic. So a few years ago, I remember I was out hiking and looked up in the sky, heard some birds calling, look up and saw just probably about 40 to 50 broadwing hawks. And I wasn't even at a particular hawk watching location. It was incredible to see those guys moving around. So if you have wide open views or areas that are a little bit higher in location than others where you can see out in the open really well, it's a great opportunity to look up and see if there are hawks. If you perhaps want to experience a hawk watch in a more formal setting, there's a few places around Ontario you can do that. Now, I'm not sure exactly what's going on with some of these locations during COVID. They may not be operating as normal. So you may want to check in on their websites and do a quick search. But one of my favorite places to go for hawk watching is the Holiday Beach Hawk Festival. So I'm not sure if that's running this year or not, but that's actually where this photo was taken of me and a sharp-shinned hawk. If you look closely behind me, you might be able to see some mist nets. So they do raptor banding at that hawk watch. They have a wonderful tower with experts that are up there, so you can go up and learn more about the process and how to count hawks and ID them. And so it's just a really, really fun weekend. So I highly recommend it. It does happen in September every year, generally. Then we have some other places in Ontario, perhaps a little bit less formal. So there's spots on the Niagara Peninsula. Hyde Park in Toronto is a really good place for hawk watching, and there's usually counters there during the fall migration. The Rosetta Mclean's Gardens, that's in Scarborough, Cranberry Marsh, Point Pelee if you're down that way, especially on the tip where there's great viewing opportunities, and the Thunder Cape Bird Observatory. So any of those places would be wonderful spots to observe hawks in the fall during their migration. And then on the flip side, during times when you can actually travel, there's a lot of great places too in the US. So you can actually follow the hawks south. And if you want to, you can go all the way down to Central America to see some of these hawks. So I know Panama is really well known for just spectacular viewing of hawks as they're coming south from all over North America. So hawk watching is a lot of fun, and it's really neat to observe all those raptors in flight. Now, in terms of nocturnal migration, this is a little bit trickier to observe for obvious reasons. It's happening all through the night. You can't see very well. However, there are an increasing number of people who are interested in observing nocturnal migrants. And so this is sort of becoming like a popular niche in bird watching. You do have to use your ears a lot, and birds make sort of single note or small sounds as they're migrating, and folks with a really well-trained ear can pick up the species in flight as they note the calls going overhead. So that's pretty incredible for folks who want to experience that. And you can even during like the September full moon or early October full moon, depending on the year and when that full moon is happening, you can actually count the birds as they're passing across the moon if they're passing in the right place. So Not as easy to monitor nocturnal migration, not as easy to see, but certainly for someone who wants a challenge, it's a fun thing to do. Now, I know this presentation is about birds, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the other animals in Ontario who are migrating right now, because there's some other spectacular flights going on. And while you're out bird watching, these can be other things that you can keep an eye out for. So there are butterflies, dragonflies, and bats that are migrating in Ontario right now. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, it is the time of year that monarchs begin their journey south. So they are crossing thousands of kilometers. They're moving over the Great Lakes, Lake Erie. And so they can actually build up in certain areas. So a good example of this is at Point Pelee. Monarch butterflies will accumulate perhaps even in the thousands if the weather isn't cooperating for them, and they'll build and build and build, and when the weather conditions are good, they will cross Lake Erie. And I know that in recent years, Pelee has been just spectacular for viewing thousands of butterflies. So if this is something of interest to you, or if you're birding down there, this is another great spectacle to take in. I personally love the Rosetta Mclean Gardens. If you've never been there, it's in Scarborough on the Bluffs, and they do monarch tagging there. So you can go and see the folks, the volunteers, as they're catching and tagging butterflies. And there's also a hawk watch going on at the same time. So there'll be somebody in a lawn chair or folding chair watching the hawks, and perhaps a couple of people. And I'm sure they would be more than happy to answer questions, provided that they don't have to take their eyes off the skies. But yeah, so butterflies are a wonderful thing to observe. And there's other species that are moving through Rosetta Mclean's as well. It's just phenomenal, the amount of butterflies and birds at that park. Not only do you see the monarchs coming through, there's giant swallowtails, there's a whole host of other butterflies like question marks and admirals and all kinds of stuff. And then the birds on top of that. I always have really good luck there seeing things like warblers as they're passing through, and other songbirds. So that is a small park, but talk about, you know, a lot in a small area. And it's also close to some other areas, like it's not too far away from Ashbridges Bay, which can be really productive for shorebirds, depending on the conditions. So a great area all along Lake Ontario in Toronto. Green darners are a species of dragonfly that migrate. So I actually, when I was outside today doing some work, enjoying the lovely weather, it was a beautiful day, I saw several green darners in my backyard, which hasn't been something I've seen the rest of the summer. So this is a species of dragonfly that actually migrates, and these guys go to the southern US, and they can go all the way down through to Mexico and even the Caribbean. So they migrate hundreds of kilometers each year. And just like the monarch has multiple generations in order to complete their full migration to and from Ontario, the green darner is in the same boat. So it actually takes them 3 generations to complete a 1-year cycle of migration, but they all depart in September and October. So now is the time to see them. So keep an eye out for those guys as well. And lastly, I'll finish off with bats, because as you're looking up to the treetops for birds, you may spot some of our migrating bats. So we have 8 species of bats in Ontario, and 3 of them are migratory: the red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver-haired bat. And these bats are migrating anywhere to the southern United States and as far as Mexico and the Caribbean as well. And they are migrating in the fall at this time, and they typically will perch in treetops to roost during the day, and sometimes in around buildings as well. But that's generally when these guys are photographed during their migration, because they turn up in some funny places and they're a lot more obvious to folks. So that is definitely another animal you want to keep your eyes out for. Okay, let's move on to ID challenges. So I kind of touched on this, but fall definitely poses some ID challenges, even for the most seasoned bird watcher. So fall equals strange looking birds. There's no 2 ways about it. As I mentioned, we have molting and transitional plumage going on. So birds are transitioning into their basic or non-breeding plumages. We have young birds who look very different from adults in some cases. And fall is the unofficial season for rarities in Ontario, meaning birds that maybe we don't expect to show up, turning up because they are perhaps too young to be experienced to migrate, or they just kind of got brought in by the weather. So this is also a season when rarities typically show up in Ontario. So let's start off talking about molting and transitional plumage. So I've included a picture that I love of a female northern cardinal. We get questions every single year about molting cardinals and molting blue jays. People will call the store or send us messages saying, I have a really sick cardinal. It has no feathers on its head. And, you know, we are able to inform them that that's actually totally normal for birds to be going through a molt at this time of year. So you get some really strange looking birds. I had a really weird looking blue jay today who showed up with no head feathers. So that is totally normal. You don't have to be alarmed. And basically, molting, as you are probably aware, is the process of replacing feathers. So strategies of molting can vary depending on the species. So some may choose to molt all of their feathers at once, whereas others may do a partial molt, maybe just their flight feathers or their body feathers. And I'm using the word choose because I recently learned that some species can actually stop their molt if they're not in a favorable condition. So molting takes a ton of energy, and birds typically avoid molting when there are high energy demands. So during periods of migration or nesting, when they're actually physically doing the migration, they're probably not going to be molting. So I recently read that, I think it was bald eagles, they can molt some of their feathers around nesting time, but then when the eggs are laid in the nest, females can actually just stop their molt, full out stop their molt until the nestlings are in a much better place, and then they can resume molting their feathers. So I thought that was fascinating. That wasn't something I had ever read before. So after the breeding season is over, parent birds look very raggedy in a lot of cases. They are covered in dirt because bird nests can be quite dirty. The baby birds are dropping their droppings in there, and the parents are carrying them away. And so they get really worn and dirty looking. They're missing feathers in places. It's time to get a fresh molt after raising kids. They get really tired and need a molt. So a lot of birds will molt after their breeding is complete. Now, some of the migrants will molt upon entering their wintering grounds. So, you know, there's no point in molting if you have to make a huge migration journey and your feathers might get damaged along the way. So some birds choose a strategy of molting once they are on their wintering grounds, and others will molt before they even leave. So there's some different molting strategies depending on the species. So here's a picture I took of a really funny looking bald blue jay. So you can see what I'm talking about. So, but basically all birds kind of fall into one of three categories. So they either complete one molt per year, and for many that's late summer right now, basically. So chickadees, hawks, hummingbirds, jays, owls, and woodpeckers are some of the birds that do that. And they will molt their feathers once per year. And then others will do a complete molt and a partial molt before breeding season. So an example of this would be like the warblers. So right now, warblers in the fall do their complete molt. So they have what's called basic plumage, how they look most of the year. And then come breeding season, when we're used to them looking like little jewels, those bright colors, they get that way by doing a partial molt. And that's the same also for buntings, like indigo buntings and scarlet tanagers as well, those birds that get that really bright, rich color. Some birds go through 2 complete molts per year, so once prior to breeding and once after breeding. And so usually that's in species where the habitats are quite harsh and they wear through their feathers really quickly. So for example, marsh wrens and bobolinks, they're in kind of really abrasive vegetation. So it's of benefit for them to molt twice a year to make sure that their feathers are in tip-top shape. So in terms of non-breeding plumage, this is also called winter or basic. This is happening when bright, beautiful plumage is no longer needed. So a good example is an indigo bunting. So here I have a male indigo bunting in the picture. You can tell because of those blue feathers poking through. And basically, male indigo buntings will lose their blue color, which is kind of a trick on the eye. They're not actually blue, but that's a that's a topic for another presentation. They just reflect the color blue, but they lose those feathers after they're done breeding, because they don't need to really attract a mate anymore. So they don't need to be you know, singing on territory, attracting the ladies, telling them how good they look, proving their fitness and suitability for being a parent. So they're done with all of those needs. And of course, the bright colorations can make birds more obvious to predators, and they don't need that on their wintering grounds. So by transitioning into a basic plumage, a plumage without the bright blue color, they're able to be a little bit more secretive, and that helps protect them as well. Okay, fall warbler. So I'm hoping this works. We practiced ahead of time, but I have a little link on my screen. So I'm going to take you to, hopefully everybody can see that. Just, I guess, type a message if you can't. But I wanted to show you the Mcgill Bird Observatory. So I highly recommend, if you are interested in learning more about fall warblers, please visit the Mcgill Bird Observatory's website, because they have a wonderful kind of cheat sheet for confusing fall warblers. So this is really, really handy, and it's, you know, not even too large that you can't print it off and carry it with you when you're out on the trails. So I love that they have how they have categorized fall warblers. So warblers, like I said, they look very different in the fall than they do in the spring. They lose a lot of their color, but they still retain some key features. So I like they've separated all the warblers into kind of two parts here, with wing bars, okay, those markings on the wings, and without, okay, and then they've further broken those down. So it starts with the true wingers, is what they call them, the golden and blue winged warblers. And they go through what color the wing bars are, and if they're present, what their face looks like, what their throat looks like, and the undertail. So if you've not had the pleasure of really searching for warblers and trying to identify them, warbler bums are very handy for telling you who you're looking at. There are full charts you can get just showing you warbler tails, so that you can ID them from underneath, because they like to stay really high a lot of the time, and for the most part you're looking at them from underneath. So undertail is very handy for IDing these guys. But I really like the simplicity here, because it breaks it down so nicely, and it's such an easy kind of chart to carry with you. And they just go through, first of all the guys with wing bars, what the distinguishing features are, and then those without wing bars, the distinguishing features. So, you know, if you take a picture of a warbler and you're not sure exactly which one it is, this can really help. Another tip I can give is paying attention to leg color, because you know, sometimes the leg color is a little bit brighter in the spring. It may not show the same way as in the fall, but you still may be able to see a hint of leg color. And for some warblers, they have bright orange legs, and others have black legs. So that can help you with an ID challenge as well. So pay attention to wing bars, pay attention to what the undertail looks like, if there's any markings on them, what color it is. Pay attention to any other kind of coloration that you might see on the throat or the face, the leg color. Do they have like an eye ring, like the little chestnut-sided warbler here in my photo, who looks very different from his spring plumage. So those are all things that can really help ID warblers. So I highly recommend, like we could spend a whole presentation just talking about fall warblers, but I highly recommend visiting this website and really taking in what they have to offer. Likewise, there's a lot of great apps out there like iBird Pro, and I mean Merlin. A lot of people use Merlin. It's a free app. I like iBird because it gives you a lot of options to look at, and the Sibley Bird Guide, which is quite expensive, but it also is a great app as well, because it shows a variety of plumages. Those are really handy tools that you can have right in your back pocket, versus carrying a really thick guide around. And there are books just on fall warblers. I have, I think it's a Peterson's Guide to Fall Warblers, which is pretty in-depth and goes through the different colorations of all the warblers in North America. Actually, sorry, I said fall warblers, but it's also spring plumage too. It goes through all their plumages. So that's a handy book as well. But yes, I would highly recommend this website. It's a great resource. So we also have a lot of young birds that are still out. So in September, the majority of birds have raised their families. But that being said, there are still birds that are out there raising families. So I don't know about the folks watching out there tonight, but I cannot tell you how many baby goldfinches I have right now, and they are loud and they are begging from their parents continuously, and they're all over the feeders. Goldfinches nest very late. They really don't even start building a nest until late July. And then in August, the females are sort of on the eggs. And the reason is that they time the arrival of their young ones with their favorite foods coming into availability. Things like a lot of the seed crops on flowers like Black-eyed Susan and the Coreopsis flowers and Echinacea, things like that. So there are a lot of young birds that are out. Here's a photo I took late in the season of a hen wild turkey and two little ones that came to our backyard. And so these birds were really small in the fall. So they are, or in the late summer rather. So this was still a family of birds that was being raised. Doves, they have multiple broods. Doves don't stop breeding. They're always having more babies. So the other day I saw a baby dove actually, and cardinals, depending on the year and the food availability. Another example of a late nesting bird, I've had baby cardinals at my feeders into September. So there are birds out there that are having young ones, and even so, there are also a lot of young ones that are independent from mom and dad and are fending for themselves as they move south, and they still look very different from their parents. So warblers would be a good example of that. There might be some warblers that look very strange, and also some other birds like grosbeaks. I still have grosbeaks coming to my bird feeders. It's getting a little bit later for them, and orioles would be another example. But they look very different from mom and dad. So it's not uncommon to mistake grosbeaks for a different type of bird. I hear a lot of the time the rose-breasted grosbeak, the young ones, look a little bit like black-headed grosbeaks, which are a West Coast bird. So I do hear from time to time folks telling me they have black-headed grosbeaks in their yard. And most of the time that ends up being young rose-breasted grosbeaks. So birds can look very different from their parents. So you want to look at things like beak color, because beak color does change in some of these species. Any obvious features that they might have plumage-wise, any colors that stand out to you, any markings on their head like eye stripes, anything that you can look at and kind of grasp if the bird happens to fly away is good to help you ID later on. And of course, pictures are always good if you can manage it. So fall rarities, I kind of mentioned that in Ontario, fall is the sort of unofficial season of rarities because we get some weird birds turning up in the fall, which is always exciting for bird watchers. You can keep an eye, there's email lists that you can join through the Ontario Field Ornithologists, and of course Facebook groups and other groups that stay on top of rare bird sightings. And you can keep your eyes on those alerts to see who shows up. So here's a picture I took of a fork-tailed flycatcher at Tommy Thompson Park in Toronto a few years back in September. So that was very exciting. There was, I think, a semi-palmated plover that showed up. Or excuse me, not semi-palmated plover, a common plover that showed up in the fall. There's things like tricolored herons and all kinds of strange birds that show up because they might be young birds who have never migrated, so they're not really knowing where to go, or they might get blown off course, as I mentioned, with weather, especially if we have really severe weather in parts of North America that can really drive birds to some strange places. So you never know what you're going to see in the fall. Most of the time, it's going to be the more common species that are in Ontario already. But it never hurts to keep your eyes peeled, and it's nice to keep a camera with you that has a decent zoom on it if you can, to get pictures, because for rarities, if you do end up finding a rare bird, the powers that be will want photos of it to confirm the sighting. So it is an exciting time to bird watch right now for a variety of reasons. Okay, so I talked a little bit, I teased a little bit about weather, so let's get into weather and fall birding and how those two are correlated. So a lot of experienced birders will know that it's important to keep an eye on the Weather Channel during migration periods. So when you're watching the Weather Channel or looking at the Weather Channel, when you see the passage of strong cold fronts, so when a strong cold front has moved through, which is associated with movements of low pressure, you get big flights of migratory birds in the fall. So that is a huge thing. So following cold fronts, birds are moving south. So after that cold front has passed, that is the time to go out birding. And in some cases, these types of conditions can produce something called fallouts. And if you Google this, you will see some spectacular photos that people have taken of fallouts that have happened. So when when weather turns really suddenly, or a storm rolls in, when there's like a really dense fog and the birds just aren't prepared, those birds that are migrating at night, they could become disoriented or not be able to really make it through the weather. It could be a lot harder for them to migrate, and they literally can drop out of the sky in extreme cases and just land on anything. You might have seen news reports, for example, of birds on fishing boats out in the Great Lakes, or that have just dropped out of the sky in areas where you get peninsulas and things like that. And that tends to happen with these extreme weather conditions. So fallouts can be in a small area, or they can be more extensive over a larger region. So a good rule of thumb during migration, spring or fall, is good migratory movements when they encounter rain or low overcast or foggy conditions can produce spectacular fallouts of birds. And of course, the following morning generally is really good birding as well. So I like this graph. I took it from the Lab of from eBird, not the Lab of Ornithology Canal. This is from eBird, and I love this picture because it's two kind of weather patterns overlapping each other. So we have the pressure centers. You can see the H's and the L's, the highs and the lows. And then over top of that, we have radar data. So what you're seeing here in the middle, on the central and the Mississippi region, the Great Plains, the Dakotas, what you're seeing is probably some circular green spots with blue around. Those are actually migrant birds and insects that's being caught on the radar, and they are basically reacting to the weather as it's coming. So you can also see in this map, there are little extensive areas to the east and the west of those little circular patterns that have green and even some yellow centers, and those are thunderstorms. So obviously not great conditions for migrating. So the birds are literally like, as they're migrating, getting ready to drop out of the sky. And this is from 11:30 at night, Eastern Standard Time. So cold fronts precede centers of high pressure, and there's a clockwise movement of circulation of cold, dry air. And so as this air moves south and east, it lifts up the hotter, more humid air into the atmosphere, and then the moisture condenses into rain, and then we get storms. So strong temperature gradients and strong lines of thunderstorms advance across the continent, usually eastward. And ahead of these weather systems, it's not really great for migration. If you are flying, you probably don't want to be flying through a storm. It's going to put your migration a lot slower. It's going to be a lot more difficult. It's going to take a lot more of your energy. Think of a tailwind, right? When you're flying somewhere and you get a tailwind, I found that my flights always arrive a little earlier because we had a good tailwind. And the same thing is with the birds. They're trying to catch a tailwind to move south. They don't really want a lot of resistance. So they wait out weather systems, severe weather systems, for days or even weeks if it's a slow moving system. And that results in spectacular flights once the cold front has finally passed. So just by watching the weather station and paying attention to when those cold fronts are coming up and where the pressure systems are, that's going to really help predict when is going to be some spectacular birding. So behind a behind a fall cold front, the air is much cooler and dry, and that's ideal for migration. That's when we get the tailwind, and that's when the birds are going to be moving. So in other words, get out there and go birding when you see these types of weather conditions, because it's a good time to go. All right, so moving on to where to bird. So in the fall, the birds, well, any time of the year, the birds are going to be where the food is, but the food types change from other times of the year. So they're basically going to be found, birds are going to be found in high quality habitat, which is going to yield good food. So, but the diet of some birds change due to food availability that's different in the fall than other times of the year. So for example, we have a lot of berries that are in season. So mountain ash are filling up with berries. We have winterberry that are coming into season, high shrub cranberry, wild grape, Virginia creeper, and all those shrubs and trees and vines are really attractive to a wide variety of birds. So here we have an American robin in the picture eating some mountain ash berries. And I can tell you that a lot of robins actually stay through the winter here in Ontario. I know a lot of people think of them as migratory, and some certainly do migrate, but there's a good portion of them that stay. We always see them on winter bird counts, Christmas bird counts, and robins happen to change their behavior quite a bit from the warmer periods to the fall and the winter. So insects are a lot more difficult to find, so they switch their diet to eating mostly berries. And other birds are the same. I mean, orioles love dark fruits, and they have been waiting, a lot of birds have been waiting for these berries, waxwings, mockingbirds, for a long time. And so they are going to be enjoying the berries. So anytime there's a shrub with a good berry patch, you will definitely want to check that out for birds. Likewise, we are having a lot of native wildflowers coming to seed. So at this time of the year, things like black-eyed Susans and different coreopsis, or the native sunflowers. We have blazing stars aren't quite in seed yet, but they will be. But a lot of grasses are, and thistles as well. So those are the types of plants you want to be looking for to see where the birds are. Now, as we get later into the fall, when the goldenrods begin to go to seed, that's going to be really popular among a lot of birds as well. So there's going to be a lot of birds hanging around areas with lots of goldenrod seeds once those come out. So trees with large cone crops also, so cone crops produce a lot of food for birds, so paying attention to where those are ripening is a good idea. And then there are a lot of insects still around in the fall. And so looking for trees and shrubs that are good host plants for insects can be a really successful thing to do. So Doug Talmy, an entomologist out of, I believe, the University of Delaware, has written some fabulous books. If you haven't read one of his books, I highly recommend it. His name is Doug Talmy, and he talks a lot about native plants and their relationship with all kinds of wildlife, but a lot of time he does talk about birds. And he talks a lot about oak trees and how wonderful they are because of how many insects they support. So oak trees are a wonderful thing to kind of focus in on. They have a lot of bugs in them at different times of the year. They also have acorns, of course, which the blue jays are really, really fond of. So those types of places are good to search as well. Any area that has a lot of biodiversity or a lot of different species sharing one area is a good place to search. So forested habitats, I find in the fall, any kind of scrubby habitats that are really dense can be really productive, and any kind of prairie or healthy meadow habitat is really good. And of course, wetlands are good any time of the year. So wetlands are always somewhere you want to check. They provide a lot of things that birds need and are a fabulous place to look for birds. So in general, look for high quality habitat because that's going to be where the birds are hanging out. Think places like arboretums, conservation areas, regional forests, city parks, provincial and national parks. Those are the places you want to concentrate your efforts. Likewise, if you can combine those wonderful habitats with the shorelines of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, that is a good place to look. You're going to get a lot of migrants moving through because a lot of our migrants have to cross over those two lakes. So there's a lot of great places to search along Lake Ontario in the GTA. So I've just put, this is not a comprehensive list, but I wanted to share some of the spots that are great for fall viewing. So places like the Toronto Islands, Tommy Thompson Park, which is where this photo is from. If you haven't been to Tommy Thompson Park, I highly recommend it. I'm not sure what the hours are right now. It typically is a construction site. It's a human-made kind of peninsula that extends out, and it's been great for habitat for a lot of birds over the years, and it just keeps getting better and better. There's even a bird banding station there that's very active with banding in the spring. You can see a marvelous cormorant colony, lots of great birds. So if you haven't ever been to Tommy Thompson Park, it's a fabulous place to go. You just might want to check the hours ahead of time, because normally it's closed during the daytime. I think it opens up around 4 o'clock on weekdays in the evenings, and then weekends are good as well. And in the spring, they do have like a migration festival. So you can actually, they usually have a tram that goes, which is really nice because the Spit is a long walk. Be prepared for a good walk. I like to bring my bike. I kind of have resolved that I'm not walking the Spit as much anymore. I like to take my bike down there, but they have a tram in the spring as well. So you can see, I'll get yourself shuttled all the way down to the end. Colonel Sam, Humber Bay Marshes, High Park, Ashbridges Bay, those are all areas in Toronto. And then outside of Toronto, we have Rataray Marsh and Mississauga, Bronte Harbour in Oakville, Cootes Paradise, Van Wagner's Beach, the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton, Cranberry Marsh. I know somebody said that, it says Cranberry Mash, but it's supposed to say Marsh. Dixon Woods and Whitby and Darlington Provincial Park are all good places to look. And then outside of the GTA, there are some other sort of really great places to check during fall migration. So if you feel like getting out and exploring a little bit further, Presqu'île is a great place to go, Presqu'île Provincial Park. It's really well known for shorebirds, particularly in the fall. Prince Edward Point, Amherst Island is always a good place to check. 50 Points Conservation Area in Hamilton, Rock Point Provincial Park, Long Point Provincial Park, Rondeau Provincial Park, and Point Pelee National Park, which are the sort of the big three during the spring migration, but also very productive in the fall. Pelee Island, if you haven't been to Pelee Island, it's a wonderful place to visit. Usually the wineries are open at certain times of the year and you can enjoy, and bring a bike. They also have a lot of great birding on that island. I mean, it's a fabulous place to go and check out. And then Holiday Beach, already mentioned during the Hawk Festival. So in general, places that sort of jut out into the Great Lakes, peninsulas and islands, are really, really productive for birding. So it's places that a lot of birds may rest up before taking off at nighttime, places where they fuel up, they feed. So they can be really good, especially during some of those inclement weather periods where birds are building up and waiting to migrate. So Toronto Islands, for example, if you're in the GTA, is a really great place to visit. It's very productive. I'm seeing the bird reports coming out from folks who've been visiting Toronto Islands recently, and there's a lot of diversity right now passing through there. So that would be an excellent place to visit as well. I already mentioned Tommy Thompson Park, the Leslie Street Spit, any of those three big parks, Long Point, Rondeau, Pelee, they all jut out into Lake Erie, and of course Pelee Island, and Amherst Island. So there's a lot of great places to look, but in particular, those peninsulas that kind of jut out into the Great Lakes are good places to search. And don't forget sewage lagoons. Yes, sewage lagoons, you heard me correctly. So they could be found throughout the province of Ontario, and they are great places for water birds. So ducks, wading birds, shorebirds, all tend to congregate at sewage lagoons because there's a ton of organic material, as you can probably imagine, and that is a great habitat for producing a lot of aquatic insects and invertebrates, which the birds love to feast on. So sewage lagoons in Ontario also produce from time to time some rarities as well, things like cinnamon teal and black-necked stilts. So all in all, sewage lagoons are great places to check. But here's the thing with sewage lagoons. A lot of them are owned by municipalities, so you do have to have permission to visit them. So in some cases, municipalities are more than happy to welcome birders, but you have to maybe have a permit of some kind or some kind of permission from the municipality. So you might have to pay a little bit of a fee, and then you will have access to that at any time during the season. So sewage lagoons, great place to check for a lot of migrant birds at this time of the year. I touched on hawk watching already, so I won't spend too much time on this slide, and I've already mentioned most of these places: Holiday Beach, the High Park, Rosetta Mclean's, Thunder Cape Bird Observatory if you're up in Thunder Bay, Cranberry Marsh, and Point Pelee. Specifically the tip, where viewing is really spectacular, are great places to search for flying raptors. So here's a picture from the Point Pelee tip. It's nice and open, so you can see a lot of, not only raptors, you see a lot of other birds flying over as well, but it can be really spectacular for hawk watching. Okay, so I have a little bit of information on how to bird in the fall. So I know in some cases we get to a park or a conservation area where we want to do some serious birding, and if there's a trail map, you're looking at the map, figuring out what trail you're going to go on, and then you start on your way. And I know a lot of folks maybe want to continue and finish that trail route, but this would be my advice. When you set off on whatever trail you are birding on, go until you find a pocket of birds and stay there, because that's where the birds are concentrated, and you may not find any better birding further down the trail. So when you find a nice mixed flock with different species in it, stay there. Many times I've found a nice mixed flock, and you get more species coming in and more species coming in, and some of them that are hiding and a little bit more timid start appearing. I was leading a fall bird walk a few years back, and we came across an outstanding mixed flock of birds, probably one of the best I've ever experienced. And there was several species of warblers and vireos and gnatcatchers, and then of course the chickadees and the usual suspects, cardinals and things like that, catbirds, thrushes. And then all of a sudden there was pileated woodpeckers coming in and sapsuckers. It was just unbelievable. And the longer we stayed, the more birds seem to come out of the woodworks. Now, sometimes what happens is those birds are kind of moving from one place to another. And so you stay there until, that group of birds has sort of passed through, and then you can perhaps follow them down the trail, because I'm sure inevitably there was something you probably didn't see in that mixed flock that might appear at another spot that you're viewing at. So stay where the birds are. Going down the trail or completing a trail won't necessarily result in better views or more productivity when it comes to the number of species that you're seeing. So in birding, sometimes less distance yields a bit more productivity and better results. So just keep that in mind. When you find a good flock of birds, stay put until they have moved on or dispersed, and then continue on your way. So using your ears is a little bit different in the fall than it is at other times in the year when you have bird song. So you may not be able to hear like full songs out while you're on the trails. However, you might be able to hear some chipping and short call notes. So most species have a longer song, like a song they use to attract mates or ward off rivals in their territory. And they also have shorter chip notes and shorter call sounds that you can listen for. There might be flight calls. Actually, today I was sitting outside in my backyard and I heard a broadwing hawk clearly whistling very close by while it was flying over. So pay attention to some of the other songs that you might hear. I've been out before and heard a lot of ruckus in dry leaves and turned to see groups of robins and towhees on the ground, shuffling the leaves about looking for food. So sometimes it's not bird sounds you're listening for, but the rustling of leaves and grasses. You might hear a woodpecker pecking on the trees. That example I just gave you of the time when we were birding and a huge flock came in when I was leading a bird walk. I heard some pecking, and to me, it sounded very much like a pileated. And I said, I'm pretty sure I hear a pileated pecking on a tree nearby. And sure enough, there came the pileated. It was right on cue. Couldn't be timed any better. So listen for all kinds of sounds. And also the birds will kind of alert you to perhaps predators in the area. So if they see a hawk or an owl, blue jays and chickadees will often sound the alarm and let everybody else in the area know. I kind of like to refer to blue jays as like sort of built-in alarm systems for birds, because blue jays, once they see something they don't like, they let everybody know, and they let them know very loudly. So it gives a lot of the other birds warning. So listen for those kind of warning calls from other birds as well. So can you see the bird in this photo? Keep an eye out for long grasses and scrubby areas. Spend time looking very carefully in these types of areas. So it means you might have to stay put. There's a lot of skulky birds out at certain times of the year. I find in the fall in particular, sparrows tend to be those kind of skulky birds that hide and are kind of difficult to get. You see a little bit of movement or a glance or something here and there, and then they pop back down, and it can be really frustrating. But if you stay put and stay there long enough, you'll probably get a look and maybe even a photograph. So this was in the fall. This is a Lecant Sparrow. So I had to stand pretty still for quite a long time to even catch a glimpse of this bird. But when it decided to pop back up out of the grass, I was ready, camera in hand, and got a tiny glimpse, as you can see. So grasses, like long grass areas and scrubby areas, are really good for especially a lot of sparrows and kind of skulky birds. I mean, right now, birds are trying to lay low, stay away from predators. Again, they're not breeding. So thrushes, sparrows, catbirds, they all like to hang out in those kind of scrubby areas that are really dense to get that kind of protection while they find food. So taking some time and looking carefully in long grass or around long grass, or listening. Sometimes you'll hear sparrow chippings in the long grass. That's a good place to kind of look. And we could be talking about cattails too, like if you're in a wetland area, quite often you'll hear birds in a wetland. So fall may be a time when you want to try using a spotting scope. If you haven't ever used one, they're typically used when you are stationary, looking great distances. Not typically something you carry necessarily out on the trail with you, but during times when you have like migrant waterfowl, or you want to look at shorebirds, for example. Scopes can come in really, really handy for shorebirds. So anywhere where you're doing long distance viewing, and the fall, a lot of people do, because we have great movements of waterfowl coming through. I know in Barrie, where one of our stores is, of course, we're blessed with Lake Simcoe right there. And we have a lot of migrants that come through in the fall, like thousands and thousands of ducks and loons and all kinds of stuff, types of gulls. And having a scope and looking out into the water is a great activity to partake in. And generally, you will see birders on the waterfront in Barrie at certain points, looking out and seeing what they can spot. So Minette's Point is a very popular place in Barrie to do that. And we're going to touch on some winter arrivals. There's a junco. So I kind of think of the winter arrivals as old friends. It's nice to see them again. So we get a certain subset of birds that reside in Northern Ontario during the breeding season, and they come down to Southern Ontario to overwinter in search of food. Junkos are a really good example of that. So they're a little sparrow that is kind of dark gray on the back and has a white tummy, as you can see in the photo. And this is when they start to arrive. So I just started seeing, as I mentioned earlier, some of the first reports of junkos in folks' backyards and while they're out birding. So that's really exciting. And then during some years, we also get other species like pine siskins, which can begin arriving in October. And late fall, we start to get arrivals for some different gull species. So gull watching is a challenging yet rewarding part of bird watching. For folks who want to challenge themselves, gulls are definitely a group of birds that you can do that with. And some of the best times, first of all, Ontario is one of the best places in the world to look at gulls. And during certain times of the year, particularly in the late fall, November and then into early December, in places like Niagara Falls, they can be really productive for different species of gulls. So it's possible that you're able to observe 6 to 10 species in a day, which is awesome. So winter arrivals vary from year to year depending on food availability, but sometimes we get short distance migrants, and a good example of that would be these guys here, the American tree sparrow. So they don't consistently arrive in Southern Ontario, but they do in years when they need food. So if there's not a whole lot of snow and winter conditions aren't as harsh up further north, these guys may not come down until early winter. But in other years, if we have a more harsh winter, they might come down a little bit earlier. So this would be considered a short distance migrant, as would Junkos. And sometimes we get eruptions of a short distance migrant. So an eruption is a sudden change in population density of birds. So it typically refers to a movement from the north of wintering species that come down into the southern parts of Canada and into the US during years of low food availability. So every year there's a winter finch forecast that comes out. And I am so sad that Ron Pittaway has retired from giving the winter finch forecast, but he is being replaced by an excellent birder who will be putting out this year's winter finch forecast. And basically what that forecast is it's an estimate of how many birds will basically erupt into Southern Ontario and what the movements will be like in Ontario. And actually not just Ontario, it does go beyond Ontario. They do predictions for basically Canada and even into the US as well. But it's a fabulous report to look out for. Typically, I think it's available in early October. And it talks about species that are eruptive, like, for example, pine siskins that are pictured here, redpolls, evening grosbeaks, nuthatches, and blue jays. So all of those species can be eruptive. We can see large numbers of them during certain years. And so that's based on food availability. So this report kind of predicts where those birds are going to be moving, if at all, or if they're going to have enough food in the north. Sometimes they travel to the east, sometimes they travel west. We never really know for sure. But evening grosbeaks are a great example of that. For birders who have been around long enough, you may remember times when evening grosbeaks were around in large numbers at your bird feeders in the winter. And they have declined, unfortunately, significantly, but there are still years when we get a good movement of them coming through, and it's always exciting to have them back at our bird feeders, which is pretty cool. Snowy owls are another example of eruption. Okay, and I'm going to finish off, before we get to questions, I'm going to finish off with some bird feeding basics, just a couple of slides here for the fall, specifically for the fall. So fall, as we've already discussed, is a period of high energy needs among birds. So things like migration, molting, raising babies. So here we have a photo I took of a late Cardinal family. And so those needs mean that birds are looking for foods that are high in fat and high in protein. So at bird feeders, what that looks like are things like sunflower chips. That is a really high protein, high fat seed. Sunflower chips are personally what I feed a lot of feeders at home. You can also feed black oil sunflower, which is basically with the shell on, and sunflower chips is with the shell off. Peanuts. Peanuts are a really high protein and high fat food. You can feed them in or out of the shell. Typically when it's out of the shell, you're feeding blue jays. Excuse me, when it's in the shell, you're feeding blue jays. When it's out of the shell, you can attract a few more birds, things like chickadees and nuthatches, woodpeckers, which really appreciate peanuts. And other tree nuts as well. So pecans, walnuts are a good example of some of the other nuts that can be fed that are really high in protein and fat. And then we get into things like suet and bark butter, which is a spreadable suet. A lot of people think of suet as a sort of fall winter food, and it certainly is, but you can also feed it year round as well. Birds certainly appreciate that when they're raising their young, and of course they're migrating in the springtime as well, so that's good food for them. But that's a great food to offer, as are live mealworms. Not yet, but in short time, insects will be hard to find, so offering live mealworms give your birds that are staying or perhaps migrating a real good protein snack. So those are the types of foods you want to think about offering. And while a lot of the birds do rely on protein and fat, there are certain types of birds that get more benefit from carbohydrates. So sparrows are one of those birds. And I love fall for sparrow watching because you see so many different types of sparrows moving through in the fall. White-crowned, white-throated, Lincolns, we have Junkos, chipping sparrows, song sparrows, and you can see all of those guys even in one day during really good times in the fall. Swamp sparrows if you're in the right habitat. And what sparrows really enjoy, and the same is true for other ground feeding birds like doves, is something that is higher in carbohydrates. So a seed like white millet, which isn't something I'd recommend putting into your bird feeders during other or most of the time of the year, but in the fall and in the winter, white millet can be really good for those ground feeding birds. And in fact, I usually offer white millet at my house on the ground, either just sprinkled on the ground or in a ground feeding tray, specifically for the sparrows. That's who you're feeding with millet and other ground feeding birds. So it's very attractive to them, and it's a great food to offer your juncos and other sparrows as they're migrating through. So caching is something that is going on right now, and this is the birds hiding seeds for later on in the season when things are a lot harder to find, when food's a lot harder to find. So you might notice, if you do feed birds right now, you might notice that your feeders are being drained really fast. And I'm hearing that from a lot of people right now. They're coming in going, I don't know what's going on with my birds, but they are going through so many so much seed right now. And that's because not only are they eating the seed, but they're also hiding it. So a perfect example of that is blue jays. So if you feed blue jays peanuts in the shell, you will be providing an endless amount of peanuts in the shell. You have to ration them because they will eat whatever you allow them to. And what they're doing is not only are they eating the peanuts, but they're hiding them. They're stuffing them into places so that they can find them later on in the fall when the weather turns. So September and October are the peak times for birds to cache seeds in preparation for winter. So this is a great time to offer both seeds in a shell and out of the shell, because there are some birds like jays which prefer to hide seeds with a shell on it. And then you have other birds like nuthatches, as you can see in this picture, that prefer to hide seeds without a shell. So that white-breasted nuthatch has a sunflower chip in its beak, and I caught it in the act of stuffing it into a piece of bark to hide it for later. Sometimes I find seeds stuffed under, we had like a shed where we had shingles, and you see the seeds being stuffed under shingles, under bark. I found them before in between bricks on houses. Basically anywhere the birds can hide them, they do. Little crevices in trees, and you'll find seeds in the most bizarre places sometimes. And that's how they prepare for winter. And sometimes they even have adaptations that allow them, like chickadees, their brains grow 10% larger during the winter and the fall season so they can remember where they put all those seeds. So you have adaptations for survival to help them find the food once they hide it. The ones that get left behind, it's okay. Inevitably, those will grow trees like acorns if a blue jay forgets where an acorn is, or it could help out your rodent population. Your squirrels and chipmunks will be happy to find those and eat them as well. So it's a great time of year to observe caching. And I'll finish today with fall hummingbirds. So I know that we think of hummingbirds as a springtime favorite. When the spring hits, when the weather warms up, it's like, oh, hummingbird feeders, got to get my hummingbird feeders out. But personally, my favorite time to feed hummingbirds is September, early September, late August, because you get so many more hummingbirds. You have the males moving through, and this year I found the males moving through a little bit later than I've observed in other years. We have the males moving through, you have females, you have so many birds coming from northern Ontario, and then you have the population has almost doubled with all the young ones that have been raised. So we have 2 broods of youngsters that have made it through the summer and are going to begin their journey south. So we have tons of hummingbirds in the late fall. And I always tell people, if you weren't successful in the spring or the summer in attracting hummingbirds to your yard, try putting your feeders out late August and September. So don't take your hummingbird feeder down until you haven't observed hummingbirds at it for at least 2 weeks. That's sort of the magic number. So once you haven't seen your hummingbirds for 2 weeks, you can take your feeder down. For most people, that will be mid to late September. I last saw a hummingbird. Now I haven't been home in the past couple of days too much to observe them during the daytime, but I last saw a hummingbird on Sunday. We had some activity at our feeders, and I know one of our team members here in Newmarket, Kathy, she's had hummingbirds at her feeders all this week, including today. This evening when she got home, they were there waiting for her as well. So it is still a good time to offer food for hummingbirds. And I know there's a lot of misconceptions about hummingbirds out there in terms of feeding them, and feeding them perhaps would cause them to not migrate. This is simply not true. So regardless of whether you have a feeder out or not, hummingbirds are still going to migrate. They are too hardwired to not complete their migration. So having your hummingbird feeder out, even if you think it's too late, it's not. The birds will not forego migration in lieu of staying at your bird feeder. I've even had folks have hummingbirds into October, and so keeping your hummingbird feeders out a little later can actually provide some necessary food that those birds need to help them during their migration. So keep your hummingbird feeders out until you haven't seen them for 2 weeks. So I just wanted to give a little list of some of the references I used for this presentation. So first of all, some of the photographs came from Wild Birds Unlimited. A lot of them were mine as well. Some great resources you can look at for all kinds of bird information. The Lab of Ornithology at Cornell University. eBird is fantastic. Project Feeder Watch come winter. We're going to get into Project Feeder Watch season into November, and that's where you count the birds at your feeders and you submit it to citizen science programs. It goes to Bird Studies Canada and the Lab of Ornithology at Cornell, and they use that data to kind of monitor bird populations. The Ontario Field Ornithologists, fabulous group here in Ontario that has for members all kinds of bird walks and presentations and events. I took some information from the Neighborhood Bat Watch about our migrating bats, and Point Peely's website was great for looking into migrating monarchs a little bit more. So I want to thank you for tuning in to listen to the presentation this evening. It sounds like a really exciting bird walk is planned in follow-up in the Schaumburg area, Aileen said, so that's exciting. You definitely want to get out there and participate if you can. And if you have any questions that weren't able to get to tonight, or questions that you didn't think of until a little later on, you can certainly get in touch with me if you'd like. You can use the handle, which is just my name, Kristen Martyn, if you want. We also have some great social media pages for Wild Birds Unlimited Barrie and Wild Birds Unlimited Newmarket, and we have a shared Facebook page where a lot of folks go on and share their bird sightings and ask bird questions and all those types of things. So that's called Ontario Birds by WBU Barrie and Newmarket. So you're welcome to seek us out on social media and ask questions. We're happy to answer. And so that's it for this evening. I saw that it looks like all 13 questions have been answered, if I'm not mistaken. So if anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to take some time to answer them if there's any other burning questions out there.
Hi, Kristen.
Hi.
It's Aileen. So there was one, you saw the questions.
Yeah.
There was one question about feeding all year. I responded, you can do it as long as you're cleaning your feeders.
Yeah.
Just wonder if you could address the importance of disinfecting and cleaning feeders, hummingbird feeders and finch feeders because of the diseases out there.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to do that. So yeah, we recommend that you clean your bird feeders, and cleaning means using a 10% bleach solution to disinfect your feeders to kill any bacteria or diseases that might be on there. Because studies have shown, there's been some great studies recently that have come out and talked about all the wonderful benefits that bird feeding has given to birds, done by really reputable organizations, universities, mostly in the US. And they've shown all these wonderful things. Birds are able to raise more babies, they're healthier overall, they're better able to fight off disease. But the one kind of sore spot for bird feeding is that birds can, in larger flocks, pass diseases to each other a little bit easier. So offering food helps them combat disease. They're better able to fight off disease, but they're also more susceptible to disease because of the number of birds. So house finch eye disease is a really common one that we see during any time of the year, but most often during the colder months, so late fall and into winter. And so we recommend you clean your feeders as often as you can. Once a month would be great. If you can do it more than once a month, that's even better. I would say at a very, very bare minimum, once a season. I would certainly encourage you to do it more. Once a month would be great. And the other thing I would say is that if you notice any birds acting strange or any physical signs of diseases, so look for things like swollen eyes, look for things like deformations on the beak or the feet. If you see anything like that, pull your feeders, all of them down immediately, clean them all and keep them down for 2 weeks. You want to encourage the birds that are diseased to move on from the area and then replace your food. 2 weeks to a month. 2 weeks is a minimum, a month would be better, and then you can put your food back out. Your birds won't completely abandon you, they will come back, and that way you can help to ensure that your feeders aren't passing the birds along. So just to recap, 10% bleach and water, give them a good soaking, let the bleach kill anything on there, let them dry thoroughly and replace it out, and look for birds that are acting strange. So sometimes I've gone outside and goldfinch is a typically flighty bird. I've had a goldfinch stay on the feeder and not move. Even though I couldn't see any physical signs of disease, the bird wasn't acting normally. And so I pulled all my feeders in because that can be a sign that something's not right with them.
All right, thank you. And we just had a question about where you can find good locations to view migrating birds in Barrie and surrounding areas. So I've just said green space with trees and shrubs near the lake would be good, but that maybe since you're from that area or you have a store there that you might have some more specific locations.
Yeah, for sure. So Menacing Wetlands, awesome place to go. Awesome place to go really any time of the year, but specifically during spring and fall migration. So it's a huge wetland and there's lots of entrances, and the Friends of Menacing Wetlands have some maps that you can look at to determine what entrances to use. Barrie has, or just outside of Barrie, there's an excellent network of trails called the Rail Trail, and they extend across Simcoe County. There are some fabulous places there on the rail trails that are great. Any kind of marshy area like Tiny Marsh, Y Marsh, those are great places to look, as well as anywhere on larger bodies of water. So I know Collingwood, for example, places along the waterfront where there's some vegetation can be really productive, and the waterfront itself can be very productive for water birds, as well as in Barrie, Lake Simcoe, Minette's Point is one that comes to mind, where a lot of birders go down the waterfront, especially in years when the water doesn't freeze over in the winter. You can get large congregations of ducks, waterfowl, gulls. So those are all great places to look.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you for that. So we're just past 8:30. So Kristen did provide some information on how to contact, and everybody who signed up would have our contact at the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust. So if you have any other questions, feel free to let us know, and maybe we'll see some of you guys this Saturday, nice and early, at our lovely Maple Cross Nature Reserve. And you can sign up for that at the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust. Under Action, you'll see events and workshops, and it's in there. And when you sign up, you'll get the address. It's a private nature reserve, so we don't put the address out publicly because we've already had people showing up there and just walking around when they're not supposed to. Oh yeah, so Jessica's just saying about the Kirtland's Warbler habitat restoration behind the Simcoe Museum in Barrie. I'm excited about that.
Yeah, me too.
That's a whole other webinar, I think, the Kirtland's Warbler. Very cool. Anyway, so we'll let everybody go. Thank you so much, and maybe we'll see you out on Saturday morning. The rain day will be Sunday. Kristen, thank you. Another amazing presentation as always.
Thank you.
And, hopefully I'll get to see you in the store one day without a mask on.
I know.
That'll work. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.